We are starting here a bit of a new section in 2 Corinthians. We're starting a couple chapters here in the middle of the book talking about giving. And so for the next 6 to 8 weeks, we're going to be talking about giving. And for some of you, that's like, oh, come on. Because most people don't come to church to talk about giving. Most people are like, yeah, gotta give, whatever. Here's the deal, and what I was thinking about this past week is that the Bible has a whole lot of things to say about our lives. It has a whole lot of things to say about marriage, about kids, about work, about how we should live, how we should think. And money is another aspect of those things. So naturally, the Bible has a whole lot to say about it, just like it has to say about the rest of life. This is not a series with the hopes of padding the FBC General Fund, just so you know. This is 2 chapters in the middle of this book that have to do with an agreement that the Corinthian church made with Paul when he was there the first go-around. So that's why we're going through it. That's why we're going to be talking about it. And we're going through it really the same way we've been going through the whole rest of the book, which is mostly a few verses at a time. If we're going to get on board, if we're going to believe what Paul says in chapter 9, that those who, chapter 9, verse 6, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. If that's really the case, then we have to spend some time figuring out how to sow bountifully. And that's not going to take just 1 week or 2 weeks. So we're going to look at some principles over the next 6 to 8 weeks. As we go through these chapters, we're just going to look at some principles for giving, and I'm going to try to only give you one a week if that's possible, but I'm going to do the best I can. So we're just going to go kind of one at a time, and here's what I want you to do as we're going through this stuff. It's really just evaluating, am I giving in a healthy way? If what I do give, whether it's to a parachurch organization or whether it's to the church or it's some random dude on the street, whatever I give, do I give it according to these standards that Paul kind of sets out for the Corinthian church? Do I give according to the same way the Bible says we should give? That's what I'm hoping we'll get out of this. Now, today, we're doing the first 5 verses of chapter 8, but the first 5 verses of chapter 8 are going to be then repeated kind of and fleshed out in the rest of chapter 8 and chapter 9. So what I'm really only going to do is talk to you about verse 5. We're going to kind of skip everything else, and I'll show you that when we go through it, and then we'll come back to it in future weeks. So if you're sitting there going, there's all this cool stuff in the first 4 verses of chapter 8, don't worry, we'll come back to it. It'll be in the future in the rest of these 2 chapters. Before we start, though, a bit of background. Here's the reason why this gift is even necessary. In Acts chapter 11, there's this guy named Agabus. And Agabus is a prophet. And Agabus comes and he prophesies during the time of the early church when everything's kind of being formed and we're trying to figure out where churches are and do people want to be Jewish or do they want to be Christian. There's this guy named Agabus. He's a prophet. He comes and says, there's going to be a famine in Judea. Okay, Jerusalem is the capital of Judea. So there's going to be this famine that comes, and he prophesies this famine. So they know that it's coming. And anytime people are without food, they're poor. Okay, in a primarily agricultural society, if you don't have food to sell, you also have no money. You don't just have nothing to eat, you have nothing to buy or sell or trade or barter with or people to buy from you so that you can get other stuff. So they know that if famine's coming, they're also going to be poor for a time. So sometime after this guy prophesies that, Paul becomes a Christian, or maybe he was already a Christian and he heard this guy, and he says to the apostles who are in Jerusalem, the Gentile churches can help. The Gentile churches can provide for the saints in Jerusalem. Let me go and ask them. And to which they say, great, Great, that sounds fantastic. So they send Paul and Barnabas out. Okay, so part of Paul and Barnabas' mission as they're going from place to place to place, church planting, they plant a church, they tell people about Jesus, you get saved, great. By the way, there's brothers and sisters in Jerusalem who are about to suffer. So the plan is, go to these places, make disciples, change people's hearts for Christ, but then if you read in Acts, when Paul and Barnabas get sent out, the apostles in Jerusalem say, go to the Gentiles, and then they give them this one request, but don't forget the poor. They were meaning themselves. Don't forget us. Because this guy came and told us there was going to be famine and we were going to be poor. So when you go, tell the Gentiles that Jesus is for them, but don't forget about the poor. In other words, don't forget about us. So that's what he does. He goes to Corinth and he makes disciples of them, and eventually, at some point, I don't know when, he tells them about this collection, this gift that he encourages them to give. We want you to support the Christians who are in Judea because they're coming. And at some point, the Corinthian church agrees. They say, yes, we want to help with that. We want to be a part of that. We want to give to that. And they agree. This is from 1 Corinthians chapter 16. This is before all the drama happens with Corinth and Paul. This is after Paul spent a year and a half with them, and he's left, and now he's wrote them this letter, 1 Corinthians, and he says to them in 1 Corinthians 16, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so it's not just Corinth who's giving, it's also Galatia. As I directed the churches of Galatia, you are to do also. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up. He may prosper, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. When I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. And if it seems advisable that I should go, they will accompany me. So he says in the first letter, you should be collecting every week. You should be setting aside money every week for this gift that you said you would give. Now, he says that with the first letter. Then something goes wrong. We've been talking about the something that's gone wrong. This one person, maybe it's multiple people who followed him. This problem that's happened in the Corinthian church where he writes this letter of conviction. Okay, but you can imagine if these people are believing in Paul, they're following what he's saying, they're on board with this gift that they want to give to the Judean church, and then all of a sudden this guy Paul's character comes into question. All of a sudden, his authority comes into question. All of a sudden, his message is now in question. Probably those people who were setting aside money weekly, probably not doing it anymore. They're probably like, this guy, if we don't know if he's on board, we're definitely not setting aside some of our money to send to this cause that he thinks is good, that we never even met these people. We don't know. So somewhere along that chaos, they probably stopped setting aside money. So at this point in the second letter, after we've seen this convicting letter go out and we've seen the Corinthians' response, they responded well. They repented. They said, yes, Paul, we believe what you're saying. This guy who's leading us astray, he's a little bit crazy. Now Paul's going to encourage them for the next 2 chapters. You decided you were going to give this gift. Give it and do it well. So that's what he's going to spend the next couple chapters talking about. He's going to encourage them to get back to being a part of this promise that they made. Encourage them to keep on giving in a way that's honorable to God. So that's kind of all the background. Chapter 8, verse 1, Paul says this to the Corinthian church. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches in Macedonia. So what he starts off with in this section in chapter 8 is an example. He's going to say, Corinthian church, there's churches in Macedonia, and I want to tell you about what they did. Okay, so he's been going all over the place in these churches he's been planting. He's been saying, okay, you're established now. Now there's people who need your aid. You've been given much, and they need some help. And so he's been going around everywhere. When he says the churches in Macedonia, he means Philippi. He means Thessalonica. He means Berea. Okay, these are the churches he's talking about. These are churches he's written letters to. And he's saying, this is the example that I want to tell you about on the churches in Macedonia. He also calls this gift the grace of God. He says, I want to tell you about the grace of God. In the New Testament, the grace of God is many things. In Ephesians, the grace of God is salvation. In 1 Peter, the grace of God is spiritual gifts. In Acts chapter 6, the grace of God is miracles. Okay, in here, in this section, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, the grace of God it's a financial gift. It's a collection every week and a giving of a gift to help brothers and sisters in need. Verse 2. Paul says this, for in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. So here's their situation. It's not they're super wealthy. It's not they have a ton of money and they have extra and someone else needs it. He says in a test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed. It's joyfulness and generosity that have overflowed in the Macedonian churches into a wealth of generosity, it says, on their part. We're going to come back to that in future weeks. Verse 3. For they have given according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord. In 2 weeks, we're going to come back to that too. We're going to come back to what it means to give according to your means and what Paul says, giving beyond their means. There's going to be a whole another section on that, so we'll get there in 2 weeks. Verse 4 says, begging us earnestly, this is the Macedonian church, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part of the relief of the saints. Okay, so begging us, this willingness, this preparedness, they're ready to help, and they're willing to help. Okay, 3 to 4 weeks, we're going to come back to this. Okay, but we're not going to talk about it now because you'll be bored in 3 to 4 weeks. Okay, chapter 5, verse 5. This is what I want to key in on. Paul says this, and not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. This is the key principle number 1, part number 1, for successfully, effectively giving. It's surrendering to the will of God. It's they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Some people will read this and say, well, this must just mean that they first became Christians. They gave themselves first to the Lord. Maybe. But then he says they gave themselves then to us. So does that mean they believe Paul saved them? Probably not. It's probably not talking about salvation. Probably more just talking about surrendering to the will of God. They surrendered to the will of God, and the will of God told them, listen to Paul and do what he asks you to do. So then they said, okay, we'll surrender to Paul. You see, it wasn't just Paul coming in and saying, I think you should give this gift. They really need a lot of help. Let's do it. To which they said, okay, Paul, no problem. No, they went first to God and said, God, what's your will? I know this guy named Paul, he's here, and he just gave us the gospel, and he's telling us we should probably give to them, but I'm not really sure if we should give to them. They gave themselves first to the Lord and then to God. See, this is the reason I wanted to kind of start with this is because it's kind of key to everything. Because there's a bunch of people in your life that are going to come saying, give money to this, give money to that. This is a great organization. This is great. You can help out with this. We have so much need. If you go on a mission trip around the world, you will see that the need's beyond comprehension. And there's a million good things to give to. So there has to be some way to filter, what am I supposed to give to, And what am I not supposed to give to? I mean, none of us in the room, I don't think, at least I haven't met you yet, have endless funds. Okay, so there has to be some discerning way that we can figure out how do I decide what am I supposed to give, who am I supposed to give it to, when am I supposed to give it? And it's very simple, although it's not always that simple. Paul says they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God, to us. The only reason they agreed, he says, to this gift was because they first went to God and said, what's your will for us? It's the only real way to decide what you should give to and what you shouldn't. Here's why it's kind of essential. When we have money in our hands and we know some people and we know some needs that need to be met. But reality is we know maybe like this much of like what real needs are out there and what people really need. I mean, most people who are really in tight, they probably won't even tell very many people. But then there's this God over here who sees everything, who knows all the needs, knows exactly what you have and what you're able to give and what other people need. So like when you're deciding what should I give and how should I give and how much should I give, what should I do with it, you're functioning on this much information. This is why this is essential. To say, God, I see some need and I think I might be able to help them, but I don't really know if that's the best place for it. To which God can tell you, yes, it's the best place for it, or no, it's just better spent over here. It's surrendering to the will of God. It's saying to God, I don't have to understand why. I don't have to have met the people in Jerusalem. I don't have to know them. I don't have to understand why they sent Paul to us. I don't have to understand why they need it. I don't even have to know that they're in famine and they just need my money. It's just a matter of, did you tell me to give it? Or did you tell me to hold on to it for something else? It's getting to the point where you say it doesn't maybe make sense to me, but I know God's asking me to do it. It's getting to the point where you're saying, even if I think there's a better plan for it. Let me give you an example. When my wife and I were missionaries in Austria for 2012 to 2013, and we knew we were going to come back in 2013, so there was a portion of what we were getting supported monthly that we were setting aside for plane tickets home because we knew we were going to have to buy them eventually. And so we were setting aside money, and that was the first half of our trip there. And we had some money set aside, about enough for maybe one plane ticket home. And we were at a lunch gathering, get-together, just fellowship group, and it was kind of a potluck style where everybody just kind of signed up to bring something. And there was this man who brought 2 jars of peanut butter. Okay, there was a lot of Americans, and us Americans, we love peanut butter. They don't eat peanut butter over there, but they know we love peanut butter, so he brought us peanut butter. He was an Austrian man, and you have to understand that these little tiny cups of peanut butter, it's like 6 ounces are like €6. Okay, it's like ridiculously expensive. But he knew we liked peanut butter, so he brought us peanut butter. I found out later on that day that was the last of the grocery money that man had for the month. 2 peanut butter jars, bought them for us. And I was like, the dude has a job. Like, why is it that he doesn't have? And I was like, wait a minute, what's going on? Why is it that he only doesn't have any money left for groceries? Why is it that he would spend what he has on us? And so I talked with him. He was a guy in the church, and he was pretty involved. And so I just pulled him aside, and I said, hey, I heard this. Is this true? And he said, yes. And I said, why is that? Like, how's that? You have a job, right? And he said, yes. He said, but I had some health problems about 8 months ago. and I lost my job. And so for about 6 months, I wasn't making any money. I was trying to deal with my health problems, and then I was trying to find a job, and it took me a couple months to find a job. Meanwhile, I didn't get kicked out of my place that I was supposed to be renting. My landlord agreed that when I got a job, I would pay double month's rent every month to make up what I hadn't paid. So for the last 4 months, I've been doing that, and I have 2 months left, and I can do it, but I don't have very much left over. So I'm making double rent payments. I just don't have anything left over. Much at the end of the month. I have some, but so that's what I've been doing for the past 4 months. And I said, why would you buy us peanut butter? We could have bought food. We should be buying food for you. What? And he said, well, I know you like peanut butter. I went home, and in the next couple of days, I saw that money sitting in our bank account that we weren't going to use for months. And I said, I have money sitting here, and it's doing nothing. And it's just sitting there. And he's over here struggling, and he can't even eat, and he's buying food for us when he has not enough for himself. What is wrong with this picture? And so I told Carissa, I don't know. We're missionaries, and people give to us, and it's really cool, but maybe we can go home and get some more money and just beg people to buy us a plane ticket to get home. I don't know, but this guy needs to eat now. So she said, okay. I said, I don't know. I don't think we're supposed to just take this. And I asked him how much his rent payment was. His rent payment was almost identical to the amount that we had saved. And so I was like, I'm giving it to this guy. It's his, as far as I'm concerned. And so we gave it to him. We decided to give it to him and packed it up, handed it to him within 24 hours. I just said to him, look, this will cover 1 month's rent. You can use half of it this month and half of it next month because you have 2 months left to pay, or if you want to pay all of it and keep money for groceries, I don't care what you do with it, but this is what it's for. Within 24 hours, I call my mom, right? Talking with her, catching up. We're catching up on stuff, and she says, did you talk to your grandma? No, I haven't talked to my grandma. Why? Do I need to talk to my grandma? I haven't called her. And she says, well, there's this woman she works for, and she was telling her about you guys. And she was telling her about you guys and what you're doing over there. And she said, as she was telling her about what you guys are doing, she grabbed her checkbook. She wrote you a check for $1,000. And she gave it to my grandma and said, make sure they get this. Within 24 hours. We gave the guy 580 euros, about $750 at the time. And less than 24 hours later, some random person that we had never met, never talked to, didn't know us, nothing, handed somebody we knew a check for $1,000 for us. It doesn't have to make sense when God asks you to give. You don't have to be able to see exactly where it's going to go. You don't have to be able to make sense of how it all is going to work out. You just have to say, you have to be able to get to a point where you just say, God, okay. Why? Because he asked me to. This is kind of the first step, surrendering to the will of God. Here's what it really comes down to. What is it that you believe about God? Do you believe that he knows this much and you know this much? Do you believe that he knows the best place for it to go? Do you believe that if he's asking you to give something that maybe won't allow you to have what you feel like you need, that he'll also provide that? You see, it was the same decision for us as it was for him. I was just taking my lead from the guy who bought us 2 jars of peanut butter. He didn't know where his food was going to come from for the rest of the month. All he knew was there's some people here and they really like peanut butter, and I think God's asking me to buy it for them. He could have said, no way, God, I got, $6 a jar? I got $12 left for the rest of the month. No way am I buying peanut butter for some missionaries. They can just eat Nutella. That's all we had there. It was terrible. But he didn't. He said, okay, I'll get it for them. And then we followed just in his footsteps. I don't know how we're going to get home. But I believe God wants us to be home in next June, so probably between now and sometime next June, he's going to give us the money to get home. Do you believe that God knows what the best plan is? Do you, at the end of the day, do you trust his hands more than you trust your own hands? Can you look at your hands and say, I could use this really wisely, and I could think of a lot of great plans for it, but at the end of the day, I trust his hands more than my hands. Trust his plan more than your plan. Trust his oversight more than what you can see, what you can have knowledge of. First principle of giving, I think, surrender to the will of God. Whatever it is, even if you don't understand. Pray with me. God, we know that reality is in this country, in this place, in this part of the world, you've given us a whole bunch. Most of the time we take it for granted. A lot of times we don't consider how rich we actually are. God, I pray we would be generous in our giving, but that ultimately, God, we would learn to do only what you would ask us to do. Wherever it is that you're asking us to give, God, I pray you would teach us to trust. You would show us your faithfulness. God, I pray, like your word says, that you would care for us no matter what you ask us to give. Would you teach us first to surrender to you, God? And as we continue in this series, God, I pray you would open our hearts, open our minds, not close them. So many times people don't want to have this conversation because they think all that's going to happen is God's going to ask me to give away all that I have. Would you teach us not to give away just all that we have, but to be good stewards of the things you've given us? Thanks for your son. Thanks for this ultimate picture of what it means to give. In Jesus' name, amen.